If you are 60 plus and waking up with heart palpitations or chest tightness, I need you to watch this. Doctors say it's just aging, but new science proves it's actually your first morning choice damaging your cardiovascular system, because what I'm about to tell you goes against almost everything most people believe about heart attacks, and yet it explains why so many of them happen after waking in people who thought they were doing fine. Heart attacks are not random lightning strikes. They are not bad luck, and in most cases, they are not primarily caused by genetics. In fact, many heart attacks are triggered in the early morning hours, shortly after waking. Not during sleep, not during rest, but during the transition from rest to activity, when the body is suddenly pushed into stress before it's ready. This is something I've seen repeatedly over decades in medicine. Patients would say, "I went to bed fine. I woke up and everything changed. No warning, no chest pain, just a sudden collapse." But when you understand the biology, it's not mysterious at all. The late Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, one of the most respected longevity physicians who ever lived, put it perfectly. The heart does not suddenly fail. It is quietly strained long before it breaks. That strain builds day after day, and for many people over 60, it reaches a breaking point in the morning. Here's why this matters so much as we age. After 60, the heart and blood vessels are simply less adaptable to sudden stress. Arteries become stiffer, blood pressure becomes more reactive, the nervous system swings faster and harder between calm and alarm. The margin for error narrows. What a 40-year-old body can absorb without consequence, a 70-year-old heart may not forgive. And yet, most people treat mornings as if they are neutral. Or worse, they treat mornings as something to power through. That assumption is dangerous. Modern cardiology is slowly catching up to this idea. Dr. Peter Attia has explained that cardiovascular events are rarely caused by one single factor. They happen when acute stress is layered on top of chronic vulnerability. In other words, it's not just what condition your heart is in, it's when you stress it, and how abruptly. And this brings us to the uncomfortable truth. There is one common morning choice, something millions of people do without thinking, that dramatically increases cardiac strain right when the heart is most vulnerable. The terrifying part is that it feels normal, it feels productive, it feels harmless, but physiologically it's like flooring the accelerator on a cold engine. The hopeful part, and this is what the trillion-dollar health industry doesn't talk about, is that changing this one habit can lower risk immediately. Not in 6 months, not after a prescription adjustment, immediately. No extreme routines, no medications, no expensive devices, just understanding how the aging heart actually works. In this video, we're going to walk through 4 insights. Each one builds on the last, and the final one is the safest, most practical way I know to reset your mornings and protect your heart without turning your life upside down. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I read every single comment, and it helps more people than you realize. Now let's talk about why the morning of all times is when the heart is most at risk after 60. There is a quiet pattern in cardiology that rarely gets discussed outside medical circles. Heart attacks do not distribute themselves evenly across the day. They cluster. And after the age of 60, they cluster most aggressively in the early morning hours, shortly after waking. The widely held belief is that heart attacks arrive without warning, striking at random. That belief feels comforting because randomness suggests innocence. But biology does not work that way. In the morning, the body undergoes a powerful internal shift. Cortisol rises sharply, blood pressure climbs, heart rate accelerates. Platelets in the blood become stickier, meaning clots form more easily. This sequence is built into human physiology. It is the body's way of preparing for activity. In younger bodies, this surge is absorbed smoothly. Blood vessels expand, arteries flex. The heart adjusts without friction. After 60, that flexibility is reduced. Arteries stiffen with age. The inner lining of blood vessels becomes less responsive. Pressure moves faster through narrower, less forgiving pathways. The same hormonal surge that once felt energizing now becomes mechanically stressful. This is why the morning matters. The cardiovascular system at dawn resembles rush hour traffic forced onto older, narrower roads. Volume increases all at once. Speed increases. Pressure builds. And if even one lane is compromised, everything backs up. That is when events occur. Clinically, this appears in a very specific way. Symptoms often begin shortly after waking, not during deep sleep. People describe sudden heaviness, unexplained breathlessness, unusual fatigue, or a vague tightness that does not immediately register as danger. The body is not at rest when this happens. It is transitioning. That transition is the vulnerable moment. After 60, the heart no longer recovers from pressure spikes as quickly. A sudden rise in blood pressure or clotting tendency does not dissipate easily. It lingers. Lingering stress is what converts vulnerability into injury. The essential insight here is timing. Morning is not a neutral period for the aging heart. It is a biologically charged window when multiple systems accelerate simultaneously, whether or not the heart is ready. When this window is misunderstood, strain accumulates quietly. When it is recognized, the entire rhythm of the day begins differently. And this leads directly to the next layer of the problem. Not what the body does naturally in the morning, but what modern life adds on top of it. If understanding how your mornings affect your heart matters to you, this channel is for you. Subscribe here for clear, practical insight that protects your heart before problems begin. There is another layer to this story, and it sits directly on top of the morning biology you've just heard about. The body already enters the day with rising cortisol, climbing blood pressure, and a nervous system shifting from rest to alertness. That process alone is demanding after 60. What happens next is where strain quietly multiplies. Modern mornings are saturated with stimulation. The nervous system is pulled into alert mode instantly before the cardiovascular system has stabilized. The transition from sleep to full engagement is no longer gradual. It is abrupt. From a physiological standpoint, this matters more than most people realize. Immediate stimulation activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the fight or flight response. Heart rate accelerates further. Blood vessels constrict. Blood pressure rises faster and higher. Platelets become more reactive. The blood itself becomes more prone to clotting. In an aging cardiovascular system, this surge does not stack gently. It stacks vertically. The heart is asked to perform at high output before its supporting systems are ready. Coronary arteries are tighter. Blood flow is less forgiving. The margin for error is narrow. The mechanical stress is real. This is why some cardiac events do not announce themselves with dramatic pain. Instead, they begin with subtle signals, a sense of tightness that does not feel alarming, breathlessness that seems out of proportion, fatigue that arrives too early in the day. These are often dismissed because they do not fit the dramatic image of a heart attack. But physiologically, the strain has already begun. The simplest way to understand this is through mechanics. It is like pushing an engine to high speed before the oil has circulated. The system may function for a while, but wear accelerates rapidly. Eventually, something gives. What makes this particularly dangerous is that it feels normal, it feels productive, it feels like getting ahead of the day. There is no immediate feedback warning the heart that it is being overloaded at its most vulnerable moment. Over time, this repeated pattern trains the nervous system to associate mornings with urgency instead of stability. Each day begins with pressure rather than preparation. The heart adapts by staying tense longer, recovering more slowly, and tolerating less variability. This is not about a single morning, it is about repetition. When acute stimulation is layered onto the natural morning surge, the cardiovascular system never fully regains baseline. The stress carries forward into the rest of the day. By evening, the heart is not tired from use, it is fatigued from overactivation. And this brings us to an important misunderstanding that often hides beneath these patterns, the belief that genetics are the primary driver rather than daily rhythm. That is what we need to look at next. When heart disease runs in a family, it leaves a psychological imprint. The belief forms early that outcomes are predetermined, that the body is following a script written long before birth. This belief is powerful, and it shapes how people interpret symptoms, habits, and risk. From a biological perspective, genetics do matter. They influence cholesterol handling, blood pressure tendencies, inflammation levels, and how arteries age. They create vulnerability. But vulnerability is not the same thing as inevitability. What turns vulnerability into an event is timing. Genes do not cause heart attacks on their own. They alter the threshold at which stress becomes dangerous. The actual trigger is almost always physiological stress layered at the wrong moment, in the wrong sequence. Morning biology plays a central role in this distinction. Stress hormones rise, blood pressure accelerates, clotting mechanisms become more active. In someone with genetic susceptibility, this window becomes narrower. The system tolerates less disruption. This is why two people with nearly identical family histories can have very different outcomes. The internal terrain may be similar, but the daily rhythm is not. One heart is repeatedly pushed during its most vulnerable phase. The other is not. The difference accumulates quietly. The phrase often used in medicine is that genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. What is less discussed is that timing decides when the trigger is most sensitive. The morning is when that sensitivity peaks. This misunderstanding leads many people to focus on inherited risk while overlooking modifiable physiological patterns. The result is resignation rather than clarity, concern without strategy. From the cardiovascular system's point of view, it is not ancestry that matters most in the moment of crisis. It is pressure, tone, and flow. These are shaped daily, often within the first hour of waking. When genetics are seen as destiny, early warning signs are ignored or normalized. When genetics are understood as context, attention shifts to patterns that actually influence outcomes. The heart responds less to family history than it does to repeated states of strain. Over years, those states remodel vessels, stiffen arteries, and alter nervous system balance. By the time an event occurs, it feels sudden. Biologically, it is anything but. This brings us to the final and most counterintuitive part of the conversation. Not a medication change, not an intense intervention, but a subtle shift in how the morning begins and how the nervous system is allowed to settle before demand is placed on it. There is a widespread assumption that meaningful heart protection requires escalation, more medication, more intensity, more exertion. The idea that safety must come from force rather than balance is deeply ingrained. Physiology tells a different story. The cardiovascular system is governed as much by the nervous system as it is by the heart muscle itself. In the early morning, when cortisol is already elevated and blood pressure is naturally rising, the most powerful protective influence is not stimulation but stabilization. This is where the parasympathetic nervous system becomes critical. Parasympathetic activity is the body's braking system. It lowers cortisol output. It smooths blood pressure fluctuations. It improves coronary blood flow by allowing vessels to relax rather than constrict. When this system is engaged early, the entire cardiovascular response to the day changes. Instead of a spike, there is a curve. Instead of strain, there is distribution. The simplest way to understand this is infrastructure. When lanes are opened before traffic arrives, congestion does not disappear, but it no longer overwhelms the system. Flow replaces pressure. In clinical observation, this shift shows up quietly. Mornings feel steadier, energy levels even out. Episodes of unexplained tightness or early fatigue become less frequent. The heart is not being pushed less over the course of the day. It is being pushed more intelligently. What makes this approach counterintuitive is its simplicity. There is no dramatic intervention, no shock to the system. Just a brief window in which the body is allowed to complete its transition from rest to wakefulness without interference. The first 10 minutes after waking carry disproportionate influence. During this window, posture, breathing rhythm, sensory input, and movement patterns all signal the nervous system how aggressively the day will unfold. A calm, upright position, with the body grounded rather than rushed, supports pressure regulation. Slow breathing, with a longer exhale than inhale, shifts nervous system tone towards stability. The absence of immediate stimulation allows cortisol to rise without overshooting. Gentle movement restores circulation without demand. Together, these elements act as a reset, not a pause, but a recalibration. Over time, this changes how the heart experiences mornings. Instead of repeated alarm, there is predictability. Instead of abrupt demand, there is readiness. This is not about avoiding life. It is about sequencing it correctly. When the morning begins with rhythm rather than rush, the heart does not have to defend itself. It can perform, and this brings the conversation full circle, not toward fear, but toward clarity, not toward inevitability, but toward control. When discussions about heart attacks revolve only around cholesterol scans or family history, They miss the deeper truth about how the heart actually fails. The heart is not an isolated machine that suddenly breaks. It is a responsive organ, constantly adjusting to pressure, hormones, and nervous system signals. Over time, the way those signals arrive matters as much as their intensity. Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara spent decades observing this pattern. He believed the heart reflects how life is lived day to day, not just what is inherited. In his view, damage does not begin with collapse. It begins with rhythm. When the body is repeatedly pushed before it is ready, strain becomes the background state. The heart adapts by tightening, working harder, and tolerating less variation. Eventually, that adaptation becomes vulnerability. A calm beginning protects the entire day, not as a comforting idea, but as a biological reality. The early morning is when the body's internal systems accelerate together. Hormones rise, blood pressure climbs, circulation shifts. In younger years, this transition is smooth. With age, the same transition becomes abrupt. The heart is no longer buffered by elasticity or quick recovery. This is where modern life creates friction. Mornings are no longer gradual. They are compressed, stimulated, and urgent. When acute stress is layered onto an already vulnerable window, the heart absorbs a level of pressure that would be manageable later in the day but risky at dawn. This is exactly what Dr. Peter Attia describes when he speaks about acute stress layered on chronic risk. The event itself is sudden. The setup is not. Understanding this removes fear and replaces it with clarity. The goal is not to control everything or to live cautiously. It is to recognize which moments carry disproportionate influence. The heart responds more to timing than most people realize. Pressure delivered at the wrong moment does more damage than higher pressure delivered later. Over months and years, this difference accumulates. Blood pressure patterns stabilize. Nervous system tone shifts. Energy becomes steadier rather than spiked. The heart spends less time defending itself and more time functioning efficiently. This is not about avoiding activity. It is about sequencing life in a way the aging heart can tolerate. Heart attacks are rarely fate. They are usually the result of repeated strain expressed at the wrong time. When that time is understood, the heart is no longer surprised. It is prepared. And preparation is what preserves independence, energy, and the ability to keep living fully, without interruption or fear. Subscribe to protect your heart before stress hits.